In this video we're going to be going over sculpting in Modo. So the first question is, what is sculpting? And the easiest way to answer that is to think of the mesh that you're working on as a clay surface that you're manipulating the vertices by pulling in and pushing out points, as opposed to grabbing individual vertices and stretching and moving them on an individual element basis. So one of the first concepts that we have to grasp before going into sculpting is, what is a subdivision surface? So let's just drop in a cube real quick, and if I hit the tab key, you'll see that my mesh smooths out and gets kind of spherical from a box. And again, depending on the shape that we put in here, let's go ahead and throw a cylinder. If I hit tab on this shape, it's going to give me a different shape. So again, depending on what shape I'm actually working with, I'm going to get different results. So let's go to the box, and let's just look at a few UI elements that help us describe what's happening. So if I just have a box in the scene, nothing is subdivided or smoothed. If I look down here, it'll say all polygons, because I don't really have any selected. If I have one selected down here, it'll say one polygon, but if I have none selected, it'll say all are selected. And right here is this little guy that says polygon : face. So right now, the polygons are set to a face mode. We can not worry about deformers. GL counts just the number of triangles. The key thing that we want to worry about here is this little guy right here called polygon face. As soon as I hit the tab key, down here you'll see it changes to polygon : subdiv, or it's a subdivided polygon. So a subdivided polygon, again, is a smoothed polygon that smooths across the surface. So depending on how I model on this, let's turn subdivision off. Let's make some cuts in here. Let's just do one going across this way. Now hit tab again. Now I get a slightly different shape. Before it was almost a sphere. Now it's kind of a rounded out cylinder. If I delete this loop going all the way around, it goes back to that rounded out cylinder. If I add multiple loops, let's pop this count up to something like 4. Now it's kind of smoothing around in this direction, but around this way it's looking more like a cylinder. So again, these edge loops that go around right here are holding its round form, so it's making it cylindrical. If I was to do the same cuts this way, now in two different directions it's kind of squared out instead of being super round like a sphere. If I do this way, so now it's evenly cut throughout. Now we have kind of a melted cube as opposed to our original sphere shape. So let's go ahead and clear these guys out so we just back to our original shape. I can actually turn subdiv off so it's a little easier to select these. And grab those 4. So when we sculpt in Modo, what it wants to do is have the sides, or the faces, subdivided, but technically there are 2 different versions of this subdivision. So again, if I hit the tab key, down here it says polygon subdiv. We actually don't want to be working in this subdiv mode. We want to be working in a different one called Catmull-Clark. So if I hit tab to get out of this, now if I hold shift and hit tab, what's going to happen is down here, instead of it saying subdiv, now it says Catmull-Clark. So technically, if I look at this cylinder right here, let's just make 2 of these real quick. So we'll have a box here, copy paste, move it over. This one, I'll hit tab. This one I'll hold shift and hit tab. So again, this one's a little bit bigger, but we're seeing a little bit more faceted edges. This one's a little bit smaller. Both of these, in a sense, do very similar things. It's just 2 different smoothing algorithms. So again, at this point, now that I have one as a Catmull-Clark and one as a normal subdivision, down here you'll see it says mixed, because there's a combination of, let's go ahead and turn these all off, the faces, hit tab, subdivisions, tab to turn it off, shift tab to switch to Catmull-Clark, and then these Catmull-Clark. So again, Catmull-Clark, subdiv, and face are the 3 different wordings down here. Again, Catmull-Clark is just a type of subdivision. So let's look at a different example. This is one of the default meshes that ships with Modo. It's a little goofy chicken. So he comes in and he's subdivided. If we look down here, we can see it says subdiv. So technically, if it says subdiv, or you just hit the tab key, that's in a sense Modo's version of subdividing. The Catmull-Clark, you can think of that as Pixar's version of subdividing. It's more similar to their format. So again, just two different ways of doing things. So this same chicken, if I was to hit tab to take him out of this subdivision mode, and we'll just turn the wireframe back on, he looks fine with it subdivided, but as soon as I hit tab, everything gets a little bit goofy. So again, we have this shape that's just a big huge square, but when it subdivides, it rounds out and loses some volume. Same thing with the eye, it's kind of round. As soon as I hit tab, it gets more round. The beak is really gnarly. It's got one vertex that's way up here, but it averages out to make a goofy looking little chicken. If I was to change this from Modo subdivisions to the Catmull-Clark or Pixar subdivision, I'm going to get a slightly different result. So this one, pay attention to this beak right here. It kind of curves down and around. So let's hit tab, hold shift and hit tab to switch to the Catmull-Clark subdivision. And now you see we have this little weird point right here. Because technically what it's doing is it's just handling the smoothing of this transition. So there's an edge right here, and then an edge that goes up here. It's just handling this transition a little bit differently than this way of doing it. So again, we also still have a little point right here, but it's not as apparent as this one because again, it's just using different maths to calculate the smoothing in a different way. So we can clear out this guy. I just want to show a kind of visual representation of what's happening to the surface. So again, this subdivision or Catmull-Clark smoothing, either or, is happening dynamically. So what it's doing behind the scenes to this one polygon, so again, imagine this is one polygon on that chicken, for example, is it's taking this one polygon and it's cutting it in half this way, and then it's cutting it in half this way. So subdivision level 1 would turn from this into something like this. So again, one face becomes 4 faces. So again, this one, it would cut the same way. It would get a cut here, cut here, cut here, and cut here, which would turn into this guy. So now we have a total of 16 different faces. And then the next subdivision level, again, you can see where this is going. It just cuts each one of these, every one face, into 4 faces. So it pretty much just multiplies your polygon count by 4 again and again and again. But it lets you dynamically step up and down this cutting process as much as you want, but it does it in a way that it's behind the scenes, so it's not as intense on your computer. So technically this face would be split into 64 squares like this guy, but Modo would only be really seeing essentially one face. So again, your computer would say, oh, there's only one face here. But detail-wise, you'd get your 64 total faces to kind of work with. So again, it's just a really good cost-saving way of making it so you can work with more points without there actually being more points. Let's clear this out. So I have a new empty Modo scene. I'm just going to go up to the sphere right here, and we're going to change this from a globe to a quad ball. And then normally this will be set to subdivision, so technically it would want to smooth this. Normally I tell you guys hit tab to turn off the smoothing. In this case, instead of hitting that, we'll just change this to face. So we have quad ball, subdivision level 5, polygon type set to face. Again, face, subdivs, Catmull-Clark. Again, the same things I was talking about down here. We'll leave it to face. Oops. Hit spacebar to drop the shape, and now we have this shape in here. So to access the sculpting tools, I'm just going to go to this paint tab up here. And again, normally if you're painting in Modo, you have this paint tools tab. We're going to use this sculpting tools tab. So when I click on one of these brushes, what's going to happen, let's just go to the push one, is normally this little menu right here should pop up. It's a little sub menu. If this menu doesn't pop up when you have one of these selected, again, you'll know it's selected because it's highlighted in orange. It could be any one of these. If I hit this little sculpt HUD, what this is going to do is toggle this thing on and off. And we'll go over in a little bit what all these little elements mean. So the first thing I'm going to want to do, so let's actually have the wireframe on temporarily, is from this menu right here, what I want to do is hit this little multi-resolution button, so multi-res : off. I want to turn this on because I want to be able to step up and down those subdivision levels. So if I click this button, you'll see our mesh gets smooth. Over here it switches to that Catmull-Clark smoothing that we just talked about. And now I have my brush active. So if I left click and drag on the surface, it's going to bring up some of those kind of imaginary vertices that aren't necessarily there that we just covered. So let's hit undo. If I right click, I can change my brush size up and down. And also, if I move this menu up a little bit, if I right click and change, you can see down here it's at 140. If I click and drag, now it's at 60. So I can manually put this brush size in over here, and again there's a handful of more settings in here, and they're just going to be hidden under this menu depending on how high up or down you have this menu. So again, we have our tools up here and then the settings to those tools down here. So again, brush menu size around 100, let's say. Left click, drag, pulls out the surface. If I hold Control, click, and drag, it's going to push in the surface. Let's undo that a few times. So hold Control, click, and move, it's carving in. So again, we can see this surface denting in quite a bit. If I just left click, it's going to pull out the surface. So undo that a few times. So let's look at this little HUD down here. At this point, we have this multi-res that we turned on. We're just going to leave that on. This is just our layers, and then this is going to be our subdiv level. So again, if we went back to 1 and we stepped down, so we hit the down arrow, what it's going to do is essentially, if I pull this out, it's just going to make it to where there's less of those virtual points. So again, this one face right here is cut, going horizontally once, vertically once, and that's why you see, if I go to this angle, make my brush smaller, this little point right here that kind of comes at this angle, because again, this one face is only cut in half twice. If I go over here to where this point's kind of sticking out again, if I hit this little up arrow, so we go to the subdivision 2, this face now is 16 faces, so you can see it's a little bit faceted still, but it's significantly rounder. So again, 1, 2, 1, 2. Pretty easy. So again, the more I pull this shape, I only have limited number of points on this one face right here. The more I kind of pull this, the more it becomes apparent that this one face is comprised of 16 faces or so. So again, if I want to round this out again, I can hit this little up arrow. So now we have 1, 2, 3. Blunk, the little third one comes in and you see this gets rounder. So again, jump down to 2, jump back down to 1, let's go up to 4. And now it's even more round. And I have kind of more virtual points to sculpt on at this point. So if I look down here, our GL count, or our triangle count of this object, even though it's only kind of virtually split into pieces, is now well over 100,000. So again, if you comparatively had a mesh this dense in the scene and you tried to manipulate these vertices this fast, it wouldn't be able to kind of operate this fast. It would be a little bit chuggy and slow because again, 100,000 faces is quite a bit. So we have this left side kind of covered. Now there's this right side right here where there's just 2 sliders. And this one is just kind of a convenience thing because these 2 settings, offset and step, are located over here in the tools menu. So this guy offset is set to 30, offset amount set to 30 right here. So if I take this slider and drag it left and right, it's going to correspond over here. And what this offset amount does is, let's put it to something low and do a single brush stroke. So it pulls out faces really lightly. If I step this up to like 80, do that same brush stroke, now it's just going to more intensely pull out those vertices. So we can slide that guy back down. If I want to manually put in back to 20, I can go over here, put in 20, hit enter, and now I'm back at 20. This next one is this little guy called step. And this one is displayed over here, interpolation step. So what this one does is technically how brushes work in Modo and a lot of other digital softwares is it's just drawing a dot. Now let's crank up our offset. It's drawing a dot and then a dot and a dot. And the interpret or the step is just the distance between how it draws these dots. So if I do one brush stroke, the dots are really, really close together so you don't notice and it looks like one stroke. If I increase the step amount and do it, now you can see it's kind of a ribbed surface. Increase it even more. Now you can see it's just dot, 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 dot. So again, this one, Usually if you have it set all the way to 0%, that's going to be a little bit more intense on your system, so something really, really low, like 5%, is a good catch-all for a brush stroke, because you really won't notice the step distance between the two, but you also won't have it trying to make 100 dots in one stroke. So that pretty much covers this little menu. The only last thing you'd really see in here is this little X button, and that just turns it off if you ever need to turn it back on. Sculpt HUD is right here. I can turn that on and off. So the next thing I wanted to cover is the different brush types. Again, we were just on this push brush, which again, if I left click and drag, it pulls the surface up. If I hold Control, click and drag, it does the opposite. So again, pushes the surface in, pulls the surface out. This next brush is going to be the clay brush, and how this one works is a little bit different. You can think of this as more of like a layering brush. So if I make a pit in here, I can kind of fill this in, and it kind of feels almost like liquid as you're kind of putting it in, something like that. And if you just do a handful of strokes on it, you can see how it has a set height. So again, it comes up, let's say, a centimeter. If I do another stroke, it comes up a centimeter, and the two match each other where they're at, as opposed to the push brush, where if I pull up this side and then pull up this side, again, you'll see a little bit of waviness right here where it kind of humps and then humps again. Again, that's one that you should just try to use and get a feel for. The smooth brush, what it does is really it just smooths the surface. But the cool thing about this brush is any other brush you have active, so let's go ahead and carve a big hole into this. If I hold the Shift key and then do a stroke, what it does is dynamically changes to the smooth brush without visually doing so. So again, let's do something like this, switch to the smooth brush, click, smooth, it does that operation, kind of melts everything together. So undo that, go back to the push brush, now same brush size, hold the Shift key, click and drag, it does the same thing. So again, you don't have to keep switching to the smooth brush, that's probably one that you'd use quite a bit. Next brush is the carve brush. This works kind of similar to the push brush, but it's subtractive, so by default it will pull out of the surface or carve into the surface, and then if I hold Control, it does the opposite and pulls out. Nothing super special with that one. This scar brush, what it does is it's kind of like the carve brush, but it does it with kind of a sharp point. So let's go up one more subdivision level and turn the wireframe off real quick. Now when I carve into this surface, you can see it just makes a really sharp point where the two objects meet, where it looks like I'm almost like slashing into the surface. Flatten does probably what you'd expect. It just flattens out two different areas. So again, depending on where things meet, you can get flat surface. Again, all these, you kind of get the feel for them as you use them. If I hold the Alt key, what it does is kind of the opposite. It'll grab the farthest out point, pull it out a little bit, and then have every other point kind of meet to that point. So again, I can pull out some points and then flatten it back in. So now I have a little stepped plateau. But the other thing you might notice is this little stair stepping, and again, those are just those little virtual vertices that aren't actually there, because again, if I turn wireframe on, they're not visibly there, but they're technically still getting pulled out. So again, we have a vertice here, the next one's all the way there, so again, we have just a sharp difference right here. And then again, the smudge brush is just take detail that you want and move it to a different location, kind of like the smudge brush in Photoshop. Again, not anything too crazy. And the last brush we'll go over, these other ones are pretty self-explanatory, is this move brush, and this is the one that I use for sculpting all the time. That's just grabbing a big area, pulling it where you need it, do some major form changes. So again, that one's good for not only using it on a subdivided surface, but if I make a new file and just drop in default guy, again, this is a good one. Turn symmetry on, go to that move brush. I can just start pulling out the vertices on his head, and again, there's no subdivision happening here, and I can just change the overall form of this, give him big wide shoulders if I want, bigger head, do whatever. It's just really quick form change that you can do. Close that and go back to our default scene. So again, I have this wireframe on. Let's make it a little bit darker. Oops, active mesh. Pop this up to something like 15. Now the wireframe is a little bit darker, it's easier to see. At any point I can technically turn this virtual geometry or subdivided geometry into actual geometry. So to do this, again, we could have our subdivision up, HUD up, step to our desired level. We'll just go to the highest one. Oops. Go ahead and hit no, we don't want to step up to level 6. And again, I'm at level 5, I'm at almost 500,000 points here. So if I want to have this geometry kind of be like flattened, like a flattening your layers in Photoshop, in Modo it's called freezing your geometry. So geometry, freeze, and then you get this menu. So let's cancel this and zoom in right here so we can see the stuff a little bit better. So geometry, freeze, and this is the menu we want. So again, this you can just, for our instance, we can just leave this set to default, and as soon as we hit OK, it's going to turn this into actual geometry. So I want you to pay attention to the smoothness over here where we pulled this out. The other thing, so kind of 3 things I want you to pay attention to, is the curvature of this shape, the distance between here and here, compared to here and here, it's a little bit more narrow here, and then the stair stepping that's happening right here. Let's go ahead and hit OK. And this will take a little second to process. So now it's good. So if we undo this, it's just cached, so I can kind of step back and forth relatively quick. If we look at this one point right here, there's quite a bit that got pulled out from this one face, as opposed to, let's say, this face or this face. There's not a lot pulled out. So as soon as I freeze that, you can see these polygons right here are a little bit bigger than these ones right here. Let's undo that. So again, let's look at, make this a little smaller, this polygon right here, the width of it compared to this polygon. Oops, out of redos. So let's just freeze that again. Hit OK, let it process. Takes a little bit because again it's calculating 500,000 polygons. So if I look over here, all the little squares are a little bit wider and they're more consistent over here. And the other thing was that stepping that you'd notice, and that's just kind of called out right here a little bit more. So again, step, step, step as it goes down, because again those are just actual vertices. The other thing that you might notice is, let's turn the wireframe off, is right now this doesn't look the same as this. This way it was a little bit smoothed across, and that's because when you're sculpting on something and the Catmull-Clark subdivision is active, it gives you a 180-degree smoothing angle from face to face. So again, that's set in your material, we've went over that before. Let's go ahead and freeze this geo again. If I go to the shading tree, grab this material, smoothing angle, set it to 180. As soon as I hit enter, you'll notice over here it goes from stair-stepped, hit enter, to this more smooth fashion. So now again, this looks identical to where it was before. It's just smoothing across these surfaces. Again, there's a little bit of stair-stepping happening there, but again, that's because this is the actual geometry that's there. And again, when you freeze this, if you were to save it out, you really don't have access to open up your sculpting HUD and step up and step down, because when you freeze it, you're committing to those 500,000 points, and you're saying that you really can't step back and dynamically go up and down anymore. So again, using the sculpting tools on this, let's just grab the push tool, turn this on, and let's see if I can crash Modo. I try to do a brush stroke, you can see it's a little bit sloppy, it's starting to catch up. There we go. So now it's we're actively sculpting on this many points. Again, tried to do 2 strokes, 1, 2, it only processed one of them. Stroke, rotate camera, it's just kind of laggy, and you'll notice the difference if you try to sculpt on it. So you can technically sculpt on more polygons here, but it just works faster when it's dynamic. So again, I wasn't getting any of these choppy hiccups like it's doing right now. It's stroke, stroke, stroke. It's really not processing or catching up. It didn't do anything, so it just omitted everything I just did. And now if I do a stroke slowly, it'll perform that stroke. So again, it tries to keep up, but it really can't unless you have a beast of a computer, because again, we're working with 500,000 different points here that we're trying to manipulate at once. Let's go ahead and clear this guy out. So let's look at a quick practical use of this, and I'll just use one of the in-program models. So we have this weird little baby head. so I can turn wireframe on off. It's set to subdivs, so I just want to hit tab and then shift tab, and you'll notice you'll lose a little bit of volume when I do that. So now we're using the Catmull-Clark subdivision, so now I can go to this push tool, turn symmetry on in the X, and at this point, oops, need to turn multi-resolution on. And again, if you forget to turn that on just like I did, it'll give you that warning. So now I can sculpt on this and it'll work just fine. So again, make sure you remember to turn that on. If you don't, it'll say multi-resolution needs to be on. You want to turn it on, you hit OK. So from here, I could use something like the carve brush, make it really, really small. Again, this is just kind of modeled in information, but I can go in here, carve in some wrinkles for his eyes, do the same thing here, maybe grab the push brush, and then under the push brush, didn't go over this, but there's a fold and an inflate brush. We'll just grab the inflate brush, make that a little bit bigger. And the inflate brush just kind of is like putting air into an object like a balloon, just makes it to where it gets a little bit bigger. So we could use that on his eyelids, do whatever, make some finer detail in here. Again, kind of just have fun with this. So again, from this we would have an almost or nearly finished model, sculpt on it from there, and then we'd be good to go. And again, when we went over topology in class, having mostly quads is going to be a little bit easier for us to work on, because again, if there's a triangle somewhere in the mesh, it's not going to cut it apart in two different ways like this and turn one quad into four more quads. What it's going to do is let's just grab a triangle. It's just going to grab a triangle like this and split it up to where it turns into something like this. So again, we're going to have one triangle is going to turn into three triangles, and again, that's just going to compound and look more and more strange, and realistically just make your surface hard to sculpt on. So let's kind of see what that would look like in action. If we go to the Paint tab, and just get this sculpting reestablished. Switch to the push, multi-res on. At this point I can sculpt. There's one subdivision level, it looks a little bit shaky. Pump it up to 2. There we go, now it works out just fine. So comparatively, if we turn the smoothing off of this, let's just make a handful of triangles right here. So Shift T, it just triangulates these in whatever manner that it wants. Shift T, now we can see that instead of these being kind of split apart more smoothly, it's doing this weird bubbling effect, where this one kind of goes up and down and up and down, so it just looks a little bit wavy. It's going to do that to all your straight lines, so you won't get any real straight loops, where before this loop was something a little bit more straight, like this one over here. So when this divides, oops, turn tab off, Shift T, turn this to smooth, hit OK. Now we're going to get every one triangle became 3, do the same thing. So now I get more and more triangles happening. So let's just go back to our sculpting surfaces, multi-res on, pump this up to 3 like it was before, and if I sculpt up here, I get a pretty normal surface. If I sculpt down here, you're going to see it's going to look a little bit more wavy and strange. So again, we get a really weird point happening right here, a bunch of more stair stepping right here. So you can kind of alleviate this by going up another subdivision level, and it'll eventually go away. But again, you're going to have to get up to a significantly higher subdivision level. Now we're almost at 1,000,000, and this still looks a little bit shaky, whereas up here, where it's not like that, I can do my stroke, and it's significantly smoother. So a lot of times when you're sculpting inside a Modo, you're going to want to have some type of, go over to the side so it's a little bit better, some type of finished mesh like this to be sculpting on. So it would be, okay, this is the overall form of this child's head. Now I want to go in and do some wrinkles, get a little bit more detail on his nose, his lips, whatever. But realistically, we're just putting finer detail on the major form of an object that's already been modeled. We don't technically have to do this every time. So with that, we have this file that I can go ahead and give you guys. So this is a setup of how it would kind of work if I was going to start from scratch and try to make something inside a Modo. And again, There's multiple sculpting softwares, which we went over before, but again, something like ZBrush, I necessarily wouldn't use exactly this workflow, but a lot of the same principles apply. The main difference here is when we get started working on this is ideally, if, I'll just leave this saved and unchanged, if I was going to want to pull out his neck from here, so let's just turn off these, and let's change one more setting. Material transparency, we'll just set this to 0. So if I go to our clay, or our sculpting tools, multi-res on, I can go ahead and sculpt on this. Let's actually turn symmetry in the X on. Let's go to the move brush. So ideally I would need to pull out a neck. So as soon as I start pulling out an area of a neck, let's make this brush a little bit bigger, pull this out, and if I try to pull out shoulders from this fairly quickly, I'm going to start reaching kind of my maximum as far as how much detail I can get out of this surface. So again, let's try to round out his shoulders up here, and you're already starting to see this banding happening right here. So again, if I freeze this mesh, again, stuff that we've already went over, geometry freeze, hit OK, wait for it to process. It's turning the geometry into something like this. So ideally, I don't want to have any crazy pullouts where I turn a pretty much flat bottom sphere, pull out a shoulder, try to pull out arms and legs. That's just not realistic. My starting geometry that I'll sculpt from needs to be a little bit more close to the actual surface that I'm going to sculpt on. So let's undo this a handful of times, get back to our sphere. There we go. And we can just turn the multi-res off for right now. So let's get our reference images back. And I also just changed the transparency back so I can see the reference images underneath. And again, these reference images are lined up pretty good. Top of his head's here, chin pretty much meets up, but again, they're not 100% perfect. So what I want to do is just manipulate this guy into shape. So symmetry's on in the X. I'll just use the move brush and start pulling up these surfaces just so this matches a little bit better. Go to the front, pull that in, start pulling his jaw down a bit. So again, with this, I just want to make sure that the geometry that I do have is good. So the first thing that, again, we came into a problem was right here. We had a problem with the neck. So let's turn both of these off. Let's go ahead and extrude and pull down. Extrude and pull down again. Turn these back on so we can look at them. And then from here, I can just, again, take advantage of the modeling tools. Let's actually see where this one meets up. Yeah, let's undo that and actually have his neck be a little bit wider. So we have 6 total. And then the width should be good. So something like this. So pull that guy down. Pull it down again. And then for this width, instead of bringing these 2 vertices out, I'll keep this a little bit more square. So let's grab these 2 on the edges, extrude those, pull them out, scale them down a little bit, and now I can manipulate these into place. So our overall shape just matches our target a little bit better. So I'll pull these out, go to the front view. I just want to pull this down so it matches the shoulders a little bit better. Let's grab this, do a loop slice, set it to 1. Now I can turn these off, and from here I can grab these corners and just make them a little bit more round. So something like that. And pull that out. So again, we just have a little bit better of a base we're starting from. Again, somewhere in there should be fine. So again, now when I divide this, I have quite a bit more faces here. If I want to give him a little bit more room for his shoulders, I could do another loop slice there. And again, this, if I wanted it to be flat, I can just scale it on the y-axis, pull it down, and call it good. Now I have kind of a working bust. Now if I needed a little bit more geo for the nose, technically I could grab something like this, extrude it, turn symmetry off, scale it in, and that would give me a little bit more geo. I could also just grab this part, extrude, pull out, and have some type of a little bit more working geo like this, because again we have, instead of it just being these two faces, now we have this loop that's kind of going around here. And again, when that gets divided, it'll get cut up going this way and this way. So again, it'll just give us a little bit more geo. And feel free to turn our reference back on. Make sure our nose is in the right spot, which it definitely wasn't. So let's just undo that. Get back to where it was, make sure we have one vert, yep. So with turning this on, I could grab this guy, extrude it out, and give him a little bit more of that geo for the nose. But we're gonna leave it as is. Other thing you might wanna do, let's actually do this for the ear just so you can see what's going on, would be let's do an extrusion. Back up a bit, turn symmetry on. Grab it so it says 8 polygons, I have 4 on the left, 4 on the right. Extrude, scale out, and pull this ear out a little bit. You can even rotate that in. So something like that. Now we'll just have a little bit more geo for the ear. That'll make a little bit more sense once this gets rolling. So again, let's actually group these two together. So Shift or Control G makes a group. Now I can turn them both on and off in one go. And we have our starting base mesh in a sense. And just in case Modo crashes, we'll go ahead and name this, do version history, so just name this head 01, and call it good. So from here, I can turn my group back on, have my mesh selected, turn on one of the sculpting tools, multi-res we want on. It's already set to 4 subdivision levels. Just out of good habit to get started in is normally you want to start at a lower subdivision and work your way up. But from here, I could technically grab push brush, hold control, kind of pull in where an eye's at. I don't have to go too far in, I'm just getting kind of my base points. His nose is going to come out right here. His lips will be right here. And those I just kind of pulled out just so I could get a start of where everything's at. Because realistically I'm not going to be able to sculpt with this guy open as a crutch the entire time. Again, you can keep referencing it. What I could do is just go ahead and duplicate it. So now there's 2 of the same thing. This one, I'll go ahead, oops, I have the mesh selected. There we go, grab the group, move it over. So now there's pretty much 2 of the same thing, so we'll turn this one off. But now we have this one that we can look at for reference. This one I really don't need that transparency on, it's kind of distracting at this point. So material transparency tab, well, material selected, property tab, material trans here, transparent amount set to 20, so let's drop that down to 0. And then we have this color in here, so let's go ahead, get that something a little bit closer to white. And then I can turn this wireframe off by holding Control and 1, and then hover over this toggle wireframe, and then let go. Let's go back to the push tool. Now from here, I can look at this guy, and using my push tool, my move tool, pretty much whatever tool you need to get this done, we can start making this. So again, I can start pulling out his nose a little bit more, get the width here, and now just start overall sculpting. Again, another thing to keep in mind, the move brush is going to be your hand. Let's actually step up to stage 3. Because this one I can go ahead, look from the side, potentially exactly from the side, see what's going on with his chin. Do I need to pull it down? Move it out, whatever. I can see if my nose is too high, too low. And start manipulating overall form. So I'm going to bring his eye back. And again, this is just going to be the process of pulling and pushing vertices where you see them over here. to get the shape that you need. So again, we want to be mindful of bony landmarks. If you've ever had a sculpting class at all that stuff's going to come into play here. Again, remember, hold shift will smooth out an area if you need to do that. His eyes, we could drop in a separate set of spheres. So let's do that. This one's just called sphere, we'll rename it bust. And for a new mesh, hit this model tab. Just throw in a quad ball, turn symmetry off. We can place this eye roughly where the other one is. If I want to make my life a little easier, I can just turn on our reference, mirror over the eye. Now I kind of have two different eyes to work with. And just make sure they're lined up on these sides as well. Go back to our bust. Turn this off, and now the other thing that you'd want to do is right now my secondary mesh is shown as a wireframe. So if I hit the O key, I can do inactive mesh. I want to be displayed as default, and now I can actually see that mesh in there. So now I can close this, go back to my move brush, and now I can start manipulating this face to get the overall form of this one. And again, we just want to be mindful of where his cheeks are. So comparing right here, this curve, being mindful of where I'm putting the form here. Same thing with the lips, and this is just something that you can slowly build up over time and work from there. So when sculpting in Modo, you can either have an almost finished mesh like the baby head and just add more details to it, or you can do something like this, where you're starting almost from scratch, like something from a sphere, and creating something completely new with or without reference images, and use however you need.